Many football fans, especially casual ones, will always prefer a high-scoring back-and-forth game over a gritty defensive battle fought in the trenches. And while that is understandable, it is often in the trenches and through that grit where football games are won and champions are made. There have been a lot of great defenses during the Super Bowl era, but some reach a certain level of special that others cannot. We've found those defenses, as today we will be counting down the 10 best of the Super Bowl era. And we have identified them through the use of C-score, specifically defensive C-score, a metric created by this channel in order to identify the true value of NFL teams that looks beyond the mere simplicity of their records. For a deeper explanation of C-score, be sure to check out the description of this video. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's begin the countdown. We open things up at number 10 with the 1975 Pittsburgh Steelers. They were not called the Steel Curtain just because it sounded good. This team went 12-2. They were actually second best in points allowed during the season against the 20th hardest schedule. It was their work in the playoffs that really catapulted them. Their defensive C-score this season is 24.072. In this 14-game season, the Steelers only allowed 162 points, around 11.5 points per game. This was 56.2% of the league average. Now, as we mentioned, they finished second best to the Rams, who gave up 135 points. But the Rams went one and done in the playoffs, while the Steelers went all the way to the top of the mountain. The next closest team was more than 1 point per game behind, the Minnesota Vikings at 180 points. Pittsburgh pitched one shutout, but 7 different times they only allowed single digits. 15 times they allowed 7 points or fewer, including all 3 of their playoff games. They did allow 24 points once in a win and 30 points once in a loss. They were in the top 10 of all defensive categories this season, 4th overall, 4th against the pass, and 8th against the run. Next entry, next year, same team. At number 9 are the 1976 Pittsburgh Steelers. This team started off slowly, going 1-4 before winning 9 consecutive games, primarily because of the defense. In this season, the first in NFL history with 28 teams, they did finish first in points allowed, and they did so against the top 10 schedule. In all, their defensive C-score is 24.411. This Steelers unit kept it to single digits. That is, they allowed 138 points during the year for 9.86 points per game. This was 51.5% of the league average. The next closest team to them was once again the Vikings, but a little bit further behind at 176 points allowed. Pittsburgh pitched 5 shutouts this season, including 3 in a row. 10 different times they allowed 14 points or fewer. But 3 different times they allowed 24 plus points, twice early in the season while they struggled, and once in the playoffs when they got eliminated. The Steelers were top 6 across the board here, 1st in total defense, 6th against the pass, 1st against the run, and 5th in takeaways. Defenses tend to have the cooler nicknames. At number 8 is the Legion of Boom, the 2013 Seattle Seahawks. They were a 13-3 team. They led the league in fewest points allowed, and like the 76 Steelers, they did so against the top 10 schedule. Their defensive C-score clicks up to 24.599. Now, this is a different era than the 1970s. Seattle allowed 231 points for nearly 14.5 points per game. This was still good for just over 60% of league average. Their closest competitor was fairly close. The Carolina Panthers allowed 241 points this year. Seattle may have only pitched 1 shutout, but 8 different times they allowed 13 points or fewer. 6 of those were in the single digits. They only allowed over 20 points 3 times. One of those single-digit games came in the Super Bowl against the team that still holds the NFL record for most points scored in a single game. Seattle led the league in total defense, they led the league in passing defense, and they led the league in takeaways. Taking the number 7 spot is the less heralded of the back-to-back Super Bowl championships won by the Miami Dolphins. This is the 1973 team. Yes, they took a couple of losses, but they were powerful across the board in every other way. They led the league in fewest points allowed, they played a much tougher schedule than the 72 team did, and they had a more dominant run in the playoffs. Their defensive C-score is 25.467. And what a defense this team had. They only allowed 150 points this season for about 10.7 points per game. This was around 55% of league average. For the third time, we see the Minnesota Vikings coming in second place at 168 points allowed. The Dolphins shut out their opponents on 2 different occasions. On 11 different occasions, they allowed 13 points or fewer, including in the AFC title game and in the Super Bowl. Their opponents put up over 16 points just 2 times at 23 and 26, but those were both Miami victories. The Dolphins wound up finishing 3rd in overall defense, but were number 1 against the pass. This should be a very familiar defense to all football fans. At number 6, we have the 2000 Baltimore Ravens. This team went 12-4, but when you consider that they went 5 consecutive games without scoring an offensive touchdown, that becomes very impressive. They topped the league in fewest points allowed. The only thing that hurts them slightly is their strength of schedule, which was 3rd easiest in the league. But that defensive C-score remains very high at 27.057. This was a more offensive era than the 1970s, but it hadn't quite blown up yet. That said, the Ravens only allowed 168 points this season, good for 10.5 points per game, just over half of the league average. The next closest team to them were the Tennessee Titans in the same division at 191 points. Teams put a 0 on the scoreboard against Baltimore 4 different times this season. 15 times out of 20 games played, they allowed 10 points or fewer, including all 4 of their playoff games. The most they gave up was 20, 23, and then 36 very early in the season, which were all victories. In the Super Bowl, their actual defense did not allow a single point, but their special teams did allow 1 kick return for a touchdown. In all, the Ravens were the number 2 overall defense this season, but they were a dominant number 1 against the run, and they led the way in most takeaways. We head back to the very beginning of the Super Bowl era. At number 5 are Vince Lombardi's 1966 Green Bay Packers. The NFL only had 15 teams at this time, but the Packers did lead the league in fewest points allowed, and they did play a top half strength of schedule. That adds up to a defensive C-score of 27.533. This legendary Packers defense only allowed 172 points this season, 12.3 points per game. This was 56% of league average. They were 40 points ahead of their closest competitor, which was the LA Rams at 212. They did only pitch 1 shutout, but 10 times they allowed 14 points or fewer, including the Super Bowl, and 6 different times they only allowed single digits. 3 different times their opponents breached 20 or more on the scoreboard, including 27 points allowed in the NFL title game. But 2 of those, including that title game, were wins for the Packers. They were super consistent across the board. They were the 3rd best overall defense, they were number 1 against the pass, number 6 against the run, and number 4 in taking the ball away. We stay in the early days with our number 4 entry, the 1969 Minnesota Vikings. From top to bottom, this team was pure domination, the defense being no exception. They led the league in fewest points allowed, they played a middle-of-the-road schedule, and did have mostly a great playoff run, ending with a defensive C-score of 27.536. We've seen the Vikings as runners-up in points allowed 3 times in this countdown. Not so in 1969. They allowed 133 points for only 9.5 per game. This was just over 45% of league average. The team that was closest to them were 55 points behind in the Detroit Lions. 10 different times they allowed 10 points or fewer, including 2 shutouts and 1 playoff performance. 7 of those games were in the single digits. They did, however, allow 20 points or more 3 times, including 2 playoff games. Still a good record, but not up to their standards. One of those playoff games for them was unfortunately the Super Bowl. But look at these numbers. They led the league in total defense, they were number 1 against the pass, they were number 2 against the run, and they were tied for second for most takeaways. One last time in the pre-merger era, at number 3 are the 1968 Baltimore Colts. They did lead the league in fewest points allowed, which contributed to that massive plus 258 point differential in just a 14-game season. They didn't have the strongest strength of schedule, but they were so dominant it hardly mattered. Their defensive C-score is at 28.255. And when we say dominant, we mean it. They only allowed 144 points this season, just over 10 points per game. This was 50.2% of league average. Only the Cowboys could get even close to them at 3 points per game worse, allowing 186 points. Baltimore pitched 4 different shutouts this season, including in the NFL title game. 11 different times they allowed 10 points or fewer. They only allowed 20 points or more 3 different times. They wound up finishing second in overall defense. They were 4th against the pass and 3rd against the rush. As we near the end here, we have broken the 30-point barrier in C-score. At number 2 are the 2002 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This team was in the bottom half of the league in scoring at 18th best. So in order to pick up that 12-4 record, they had to be great defensively, and they certainly were, leading the league in fewest points allowed. Their strength of schedule was in the bottom 10, but what they did on the field, especially in the playoffs, brings that defensive C-score to 30.819. Much like the 2000 Ravens before them, we were in a more offensive era of football, but it hadn't quite reached the peaks that it has today. This Bucs team didn't seem to mind. They allowed 196 points this season, 12.25 per game. This was 56.5% of league average. The Philadelphia Eagles were the closest, but they were still pretty far away at 241 points allowed. 2 different times Tampa pitched a shutout. 12 different times they allowed 14 points or fewer, including twice in the playoffs, and 8 different times they allowed single digits, including 1 playoff game. They allowed 20 points or more 4 times, including a max of 26 that was achieved in overtime, and another game where they allowed 24. But all of that is easily overcome by what they did to the Raiders in the Super Bowl, getting 3 defensive touchdowns. They led the league in total defense. They were also number 1 against the pass. They were tied for 5th against the run, and they were tied for 3rd in most takeaways. I can't believe that this would come as too much of a shock. The number 1 defense of the entire Super Bowl era belongs to the 1985 Chicago Bears. Now, this team was certainly good from top to bottom, but the defense was something special. Of course, they allowed the fewest points in the league, and their strength of schedule was about middle of the road, 15th out of 28. It wasn't so much of a landslide, but that defensive C-score is still higher than anybody else at 32.055. The Bears were the only team this season to allow fewer than 200 points, allowing exactly 198, less than 12.5 points per game. This accounted for 57% of the league average. The next closest team was pretty far behind, the San Francisco 49ers at 263. The Bears pitched 4 shutouts this season, 2 during the regular season, then saving their best for the playoffs with 2 more. 14 different times out of 19, they allowed 10 points or fewer, including those 2 playoff games and the Super Bowl. 9 different times they only allowed single digits. Only 3 different times could their opponents get into the 20s, 2 very early in the season, and that one Monday Night Football game in Miami where it seemed like the entire tides were against them. This Bears team led the league in overall defense. They were third against the pass, probably because teams were throwing the ball constantly while behind in the second half. They were number 1 against the run, and they were number 1 in takeaways. Just pure dominance. Taking a look at the top 10 as a whole, we can see 2 distinctive groups from between numbers 10 and 7 and between numbers 6 and 3, where less than 1.5 points separate the top from the bottom. We get our biggest jump in C-score of over 2.5 points between the 68 Colts at number 3 and the 02 Buccaneers at number 2, with the 85 Bears closing things out more than a full point ahead of Tampa. And while the Pittsburgh Steelers hold down the 2 lowest spots in the top 10, they are the only franchise to make more than 1 appearance. Only 3 teams from the salary cap and free agency era appear here, the same as from the pre-merger era, demonstrating just how much harder it is on defenses today. Only the 1976 Steelers failed to make it to the Super Bowl. 2 other teams, the 68 Colts and the 69 Vikings, made it there, only to suffer massive upsets. The other 7 teams, led by these defenses, were all Super Bowl champions, creating a near reverse mirror image to our list of best offenses. This is not a coincidence. Defense wins championships. Thank you so much for getting this far in the video. By doing so, I can only presume that you liked it. Show the love by hitting all those buttons down below. Like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to ding the bell to be notified about all our future videos. Let me know what you think about all of this. Was it a guarantee that the 85 Bears would take the top spot? Or did you think it was possible for someone else to take it? Was there anybody left out that should have been included? I'm sure there will be calls for the 2015 Denver Broncos, and while they were unquestionably great, there is only so much room inside a top 10. Sound off on these topics or anything else you may have on your mind down in the comments section below. Thank you once again for joining us today, and until next time, I hope you have an awesome day.